Digital 410 Media proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts, Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Dennis Blocker.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II-based podcast. And we have another fantastic guest coming on tonight, but I'll be happy to let Jeff introduce our guest. But speaking of Jeff, how you doing, fella?
I'm great, and man, I am so excited about tonight's episode.
Here he is, the man with the strong chin, holding down the clean-shaven beard for you ladies out there, Mr. Dennis Blocker. Dennis, how you doing, sir?
Doing good. Super stoked about tonight's episode and John, our guest tonight.
Well, speaking of John, our guest tonight, go ahead, Jeff. Introduce our guest to our wonderful audience, and let's get talking in one of your favorite realms of World War II.
Well, I just wish all the listeners could see how big I'm smiling right now. Yeah. So our guest tonight is somebody that I recently reached out to because I finally got a hold of his amazing book. It is a work of art. It's a thing of beauty. And we've got author John Slemp on tonight. John Slemp has just published a book called Bomber Boys. This is an in-depth look at the A2 bomber jacket, and really, it's perfect timing, right? We know what's out. We know what people are watching. We know what people are into. We know that you can't buy one of these things on eBay anymore for under $5,000. So it's a really neat topic. It's one that's near and dear to me, of course. And so it is my pleasure to introduce author John Slemp. John, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Jess. It's a pleasure to be here.
First question I got for you, John. This book, this beautiful, full-color, glossy photo montage, this book, does this have the distinction of being one of those books that kind of carries into two different realms? Is this a World War II book and a photography book? Does it have the ability to serve under both those categories in the bookstore?
I don't know. In a bookstore, I guess it would, yeah, to be honest with you. I'm a commercial photographer primarily, and this is my first book. So, when you say author, I'm like, that's still kind of new for me, to be honest with you. But, it's funny. I received an email early this spring, I think February or March, from a fellow who he had seen the book last fall online, and I guess he recommended it as a Christmas present to his wife, and she did buy it for him. And he was involved in some sort of project. He's an IT guru, apparently an author himself and a well-known consultant. Anyway, he was working on a project, and he couldn't get to the book until like March. And when he looked at it, he loved it, and he sent me an email saying, hey, you need to contact a couple other folks about this book. And one of them was a fashion blog called Ivy Style. I had never heard of it. So I just, hey, was referred to you, sent him a note, and sent him some pictures and that sort of thing, and wound up sending this guy a book. He's in upstate New York, I believe. And lo and behold, in April, he did a blog post on it, on his blog, and named it the Fashion Book of the Year. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding. And I'm like, okay, we'll take that, so, and he's got 20,000 subscribers on his blog, so I don't know if it led to any sales or not, to be honest with you, but, it's a nice distinction to have, and I've been pushing it as much as I could. And also, to go to your question, at some point when the book was formulating in my mind, the thought of contacting a fashion historian to write an essay on him also popped into my head. And I finally found a young lady in New York City, Laura McLaws Helms. And when she sent me her contribution, it was 22 pages typewritten. I mean, double-spaced, no pictures. I was shocked. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And she said, oh, yeah, I've probably found enough information to do my own book on the subject, the fashion aspect and cultural aspect. And so that's included in the book. So, when I wanted to make a book that I'd like to read, and
Sure.
It's self-published. And, I did shop it around early on to a couple of publishers. You guys might be familiar with Schiffer Publishing in Pennsylvania. They did some pretty bad books on this subject in 20, 25 years ago. And when I say bad, they're The design is not great. The photography is god awful, and they don't really have any information in there about the guys, other than this is Joe Blow. He was a navigator in XYZ bomb group. Well, that doesn't tell me anything, and I was fortunate enough when I started this. I belonged to the 8th Air Force Historical Society here in Atlanta. We have a chapter, and we still had several World War II 8th Air Force veterans. So I started doing portraits of them. And several we interviewed and that sort of thing. And it just, kind of grew like that. But once I started hearing the stories, the jackets became an appropriate way to tell these stories. And so I tried to marry it all together. And the book is the result.
And you did a marvelous job marrying it all together. And for the sake of our listeners who may not be familiar or, haven't seen this, could you just kind of give us a brief synopsis of what people would expect? What is this book and what all is in it?
Sure. By the way, the proper title is Bomber Boys, because there's several books called Bomber Boys out there, but I also, put a colon and then World War II flight jacket art. So that's the whole book title. So it's a brief history of the jackets initially, how they came about, the construction of the jackets and that sort of thing, because they're essentially a work jacket, even though they were leather. And the technical nomenclature is A2 summer weight flight jackets. So they were not insulated in any way. They had a silk liner initially and then a cotton liner later on because, silk was needed for other things, parachutes and et cetera during the war. So they went to cotton liners, but they were not often worn on missions because they weren't warm. The aircraft at the time, aside from the B-29, were not pressurized. So, and that didn't come along till later in the war, as you guys know. So they were not worn often on missions, although I did talk to some guys who did wear them underneath everything else they had on. So we have that in the first part of the book, and then we go in, I broke it down by combat theater. So we have the European theater, which includes the 8th Air Force, obviously. And then we have the Mediterranean and North Africa. And then we have the China, Burma, India, and Pacific section. And that's a lot smaller than the European theater. Come to find, and I think for a lot of reasons, the majority of the jackets that I came across were done in the European theater. And then we have the fashion section, fashion and cultural section, I should say. We have a, 3 or 4 page section written by Jeff Schrader, who's an appraiser for Antiques Roadshow. And, I put the word out on Facebook, I guess, a couple of years. I finished it in December of 2022. So that's when it was finally off the press. So I guess in, 20 or 21, I asked on Facebook, does anybody know someone who can speak authoritatively to collecting these jackets? And several people said, contact Jeff Schrader. And I'm like, well, who's Jeff Schrader? And so I finally got a hold of him and found out he was an appraiser for Antiques Roadshow. And he has his own company in Missouri called Advance Guard Militaria. And he buys and sells military equipment, so on, souvenirs, etc. And he has a small collection of A2s himself. But anyway, I got a hold of him, sent him some pictures, told him what I was doing. And he said, yeah, I'll write something up for you. And it took him a little while, but he got it done. And he did a great job, I thought. His mom was an English teacher, so there was no problem with his writing skills. And a lot of it was just common sense. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Don't spend more money than you can afford to lose, things like that. And part of it was pretty funny too, to be honest with you. And then, so we have that. And I was put in touch with a young lady who has a master's in conservation. She's done work for the 390th Memorial Museum in Tucson. And I asked her, some questions, and we turned that into an FAQ in the back of the book. How do you take care of them? And one of the most pointed questions I asked her was, what's the deal with putting treatments on jackets, because you hear all kinds of stuff online. And she said, don't do it. And I said, why? And she said, well, if it's something you wear every day, a jacket, a ball glove, regular gloves, a belt, whatever, shoes, the treatment wears off. and so you have to reapply it and that sort of thing. But if you put it on a jacket and then you store the jacket, as most people do, it actually attracts dust, and the dust attracts other things. And she said basically it starts the deterioration process downhill. It actually accelerates the deterioration process. She said, don't do it. And I'm like, okay, that's all I need to know. And she's done work for the Smithsonian, American Indian Museum, I think, some pretty high-end museums. So I think she probably knows what she's talking about. And, I haven't had anybody directly challenge me on that, but, I would rather listen to an expert than, some guy who's been applying neat's foot oil in his garage for 20 years.
Yeah, for sure.
So that, and it has an index too. The other books, the 3 or 4 books that were done, they don't have an index. And I'm like, well, how do you find something if you don't have an index? Other than just leafing through it and memorizing what section it's in. But, there's a lot of people that don't want to do that or don't, can't or won't. And, at some point, it crossed my mind that people may actually want to use this for research at some point.
Absolutely.
Especially those in living history.
That's the basic organization of the book.
Absolutely.
Hey, John, I got a question for you. Can the tradition of painting these jackets be traced back to a specific person and or region, or is it we just have a loose idea of when it kind of started and proliferated through the Air Corps?
That's a good question. The short answer is no, I don't know. If there was a starting point, obviously there was a starting point, but I don't know what initiated it. I have a feeling it's a very American thing. American GIs like to customize their uniforms. I mean, I don't, and I know Jeff's been in the service. I'm not sure about the other two fellows, but they put you've seen the pictures of the helmets in Vietnam, where the guys had all kinds of stuff on their camouflage covers, and that's not unusual, and from what I understand, once I started getting into this and learning about the 8th Air Force in particular, they had over 26,000 guys killed in action from 42 until the end of the war. And that's more than all Marines killed in the entire war.
That's right.
That really surprised me. And that's just the 8th Air Force. Being a flyer was extremely hazardous duty. So, technically, I found this out. Technically, it was against regulations to, modify the jacket. But the commanders were like, hey, there were 70% casualty rates early on in the 8th Air Force. And the guys were like, this kid may be gone tomorrow. So if he, as long as it's not obscene,
for sure.
He wants on his jacket,
And
Absolutely.
something I just occurred to me just right now is it made sense that this happened during the war because we had all these guys who were either drafted or joined up. And at the time, most public marketing was done by painting. All your windows, all your signs in front of your pharmacies, all your large-scale media was hand-painted. So you have all these guys in the service who were probably painting signs or whatever. They have all this art skill. They got all the time in the world. You got these guys with these beautiful jackets and some money to burn. Hey, I understand you used to paint for FAO Schwartz in New York. Can you draw this on this jacket? Absolutely. And
that's exactly what happened. I found out that a fair number of draftees had been sign painters, like you see on the glass door of XYZ law firm, and so they translate, their skills translated into painting these jackets once they got on active duty, and for a carton of cigarettes or a 6-pack of beer or whatever, paint my jacket. And I did find out one of the jackets that I photographed had been painted here in the States after he got back, but I think the majority of them were painted in theater, which also some of the jackets, especially in the 390th, I shot 32 jackets, I think, at the 390th at Pima. In Tucson at the Pima Air and Space. It's a subset.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's a subset of the Pima Air and Space Museum. It's a separate museum, but it's on the grounds. Anyway, some of the jackets looked like they were incomplete. They had some bombs on there or the name of the aircraft and that sort of, and then there was a big space in the middle where it looked like, the aircraft would have been painted or some other design, and then maybe something down at the bottom. So I think there was some of that, especially near the end of the war. It's like, guy, I'm not hanging around England to get my jacket painted. I'm going home, So I think there was some of that, but the ones that were done, like the one you see in the back, they were spectacular. And that's really what attracted me early on, was just the graphic design and the color and the variety, of the artwork on the jackets. And then all these other things started bubbling to the top, and I'm like, well, maybe this will make a book.
It's not surprising
Absolutely.
that your book was listed as a fashion guide. Ralph Lauren has made exact reproductions of the of the Marine Corps Boondockers. I forget, there was another fashion designer who kind of made it big on MTV in the late 90s. He went on to team up with PF Flyers to make exact replicas for a short run of the World War II Marine Corps jungle shoe.
Oh, really?
And so some of these high-end fashion designers, they like the World War II garments because, as we see in contemporary styles, I mean, if you look at your normal Levi jacket that's made out of denim, it's very similar to a P-41 or P-42 jacket. It's got the same buttons. The pockets are generally in the same place. They have the same cuts. Dickies modern-day Eisenhower jackets and mechanics wear. They're a lot like the M41 jackets. And so that history of the garment from the 30s and 40s definitely carry over. So it would make sense that, a fashion blog would look at your book and like, here's a beautiful example of what fashion was in this particular time for this particular demographic. So that does not surprise me at all.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. That's part of what Laura covered in her essay about the fashion and cultural impact, is how it has continued up to this present day. And initially, the fashion designers weren't interested in them, so surprisingly. But then, some of the movies in the 50s came along and that sort of thing, and they started paying a little more attention. And, and I think the 60s and 70s, they started creating designs based on the A2, and they started selling it. Anything that sells in the fashion world is like, hey, we can make money, so it's continued to this day. And
Yeah, actually, that in that regard, here in San Antonio, at downtown at the River Center Mall, it's a high-end district, and there is a chain of stores in San Antonio called Bunker 27, and it's surprisingly all World War II. And
oh, really?
there's just all this Air Corps pictures all on the walls, and they're selling the jackets. Like, they can't keep enough of them, of course, because of Masters of the Air. But yeah, absolutely. There in the mall and walking along the mall, there's Bunker 27 and this World War II fashion and World War II music coming out. And it's just like catches your eye in your ear because you're not expecting, to hear Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy Company B when you're walking down.
I think John's thinking the same thing I am. I bet they got some shelf space, John.
I just wrote a note, so
Absolutely.
note to self.
Yes, sir.
One of the things we like to do on this podcast is kind of, because we all come from different walks of life, and this is one of the things that Jeff and I have talked about. It's always fun when you do World War II reenacting with the same group of guys for 5 or 6 years, and the first time you see Steve in a civilian clothes, you're like, I never pictured you for a golf shirt and khaki guy. But we all become from different realms. How did you were saying before we went on that you're a photographer? How did your passion and your profession of photography meet over to your desire to take photos of these jackets? But more importantly, how did you get access to these jackets in order to take photos of them? Right. How did you marry that all together?
Sure. Well, I was born in Japan. My dad was in the service, and he retired with 22 years of service. He was initially in the 82nd, and then he became a Green Beret. And he was in Vietnam twice, more properly Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand with the Green Berets. And they wanted to send him back again in 69, and he already had his time. He's like, no, I want to go home and watch my boys grow up, so he retired. And so I tell people I had 13 years prior service as a kid, because that's how old I was when he retired, But so then when I went into the service after college and, ROTC and all that, and became an armor officer for almost 11 years, but I picked up photography as a hobby in Germany. I was single and, after hours, the sidewalks rolled up pretty early in Germany. So I would go to the photo lab and learn how to make prints and things like that,
Wow.
And, and the other thing I did when I had time, was I would travel, and I wound up, I don't know why, now that I think back on it, but I wound up going to all the famous museums in Europe, the Louvre and the Vatican Museum in Rome, and, places like that to see real art, quote unquote. and why is this art so famous? Why is it so revered? And I guess it kind of, started my visual education in that regard. It's funny. I needed 2 classes to graduate college, and I took art appreciation and music appreciation. They were both pass fail, but they were probably my 2 favorite classes in college. Because they were so fun.
I always found it's kind of ironic to have something as subjective as music, art, photography in a format that they apply grades to it. I remember it was like, I still remember to this day, my first class, a black and white photography class in the 90s, my teacher did a full 10 minutes on the appropriate way to break the glue capsules on the back of your masking tape when putting on a mat. So, it always felt like I got kicked out of drawing 3. It's like, I always found it's weird to have a class where they're going to put grading structure on art, but it happens.
Yeah. Yeah, right. How would Picasso pass? I mean, how do you quantify that? Especially from a teacher, quote unquote, who may have zero talent. It's like, it's so subjective. But anyway, so I belong to the Experimental Aircraft Association, and in 2014, I asked around my local chapter if anybody had a jacket. I had known about it for a long time, but I had never seen one. So I asked around if anybody had one. I'd like to see it. And sure enough, they had their uncle's jacket. They brought it in. It was in a shadow box. And I'm like, well, can we take it out? I'd like to photograph it. And they're like, yeah, sure. So I took it out and I photographed it. And in the book, it's the Missing You jacket. You'll see it. And it's a scantily clad lady, and it looks like she's holding the phone up and that sort of thing. And I'm like, this is very cool. It had 50 bombs on the front. The guy was a B-24 top turret gunner in the Mediterranean.
Oh, wow.
And a survivor of the Ploesti oil field raids and that sort of thing. And yeah. And so I'm looking at this jacket, and it's like touching history. I didn't touch all of them, obviously, especially at the Smithsonian, they had people doing that. But, when I looked at the collar of this jacket, I shot it on a very high resolution camera. I mean, I can make a print as big as this wall here, and we have actually, and it looks fantastic. And I'm looking at the collar, and you can see the grime in the guy's collar, and I'm like, this is the guy who wore this jacket. It's a work jacket. He sweated in it, he got dirty in it. This was not a fancy, go to a ball jacket. And it just humanized it for me. And so just for giggles, I had met Dorothy Cochran, who's a curator at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, a couple of years earlier through one of my clients. And I just sent her a couple of JPEGs of this jacket and say, hey, this is something I'm working on. Thought you might be interested, right? And 58 minutes later, because I checked, I got a separate email from Dr. Alex Spencer, who's their curator of the aviation clothing collection. And he said, we have 15 jackets that will work for your project. When can you be here?
Wow.
I was stunned. I'm like, well, okay, we're off to the races here, And so I went up there a couple months later. We shot 13 jackets, and and it was sort of magic at that point. You contact another museum and say, well, the Smithsonian let me in the door. And they're like, okay, you must be somebody, So I wound up shooting in 12 different museums across the country. The 390th, the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. I finally got in there. I had contacted them in 2015 early on because I knew they had Jimmy Stewart's jacket. I had heard that anyway. And I wanted to shoot that. And they, kind of gave me the runaround. We want a letter from a publisher, et cetera, which I didn't have. And, we're not sure we have time or personnel to devote to this. And I'm like, okay, fine, So just for giggles, in, I think it was late 2020, a friend of mine was there, and he actually ran into the director of the museum and got his card, which he sent to me. So I contacted Mr. Tillotson and said, hey, this is something I'm working on. And I had 5 years of additional pictures at that point,
Wow.
And portraits and everything else. And he said, well, we actually have a PR office in New York that handles this. Contact these folks, tell them what you want to do, and we'll see. A month later, I did that. A month later, they said, sure, come on down. And they initially said, you can do 8 jackets. And I said, can we do 10? And he said, yeah, okay, so we did 10, and I could shoot it once it's all set up. I can shoot a jacket 10 minutes, 15 at the outside, so I knew it wasn't going to take all day. And but they assigned a curator to me, and we shot Jimmy Stewart's jacket. We shot
Wow.
and I was surprised. Roberta Carruthers, who's the collections manager, came in literally right after we had photographed his jacket. His was the first one, and she said, your request actually did us a favor. And I'm like, really? How so? And she said it prompted us to get our hands on these jackets. Some of them were in storage and some of them were in display cases. And she said in Jimmy's jacket, for example, his jacket hadn't been out of the display case only twice since 1968.
Wow.
And I'm
Goodness.
like, so that means nobody else has this picture.
Yeah.
Which
sure.
is why it's not online. I got a request the other day for the picture, and I'm like, no, sorry, I'm not sending it out. I've done a detail of the patch, but not the whole jacket, because I know it'll be ripped off immediately. And so, which is something I'm pretty sensitive to be honest with you, as you might imagine.
Yeah, you worked hard to get that access.
Well, not only that, it's just it's people just have such a casual, lax attitude about the whole thing, and they don't realize
sure.
they're taking money out of my pocket, literally, gas money or bread money or whatever you want to call it, money to pay my bills. And, I wouldn't go up and say, give me a gallon of gas for free. I mean,
For
they'd
sure.
knock it out of the park, So, anyway, so we shot there. We shot at the San Diego Air and Space Museum. I got one jacket there. I got one jacket in a private collection in El Cajon, which is just 9 miles down the road from San Diego. Let's see. We did 8 jackets, I think, at the 475th Fighter Group, which is a subset of the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California, which is pretty famous. And I shot 2 jackets at the Lowndes County Historical Society, which is a little tiny county, Valdosta, South Georgia. It's like 3.5, 4 hours from here south. You're still in Georgia.
Yeah.
Anyway,
We do a nice reenactment up there at right outside of Valdosta.
and what is it, Moody, I think?
Oh,
Moody Air Force Base? I can't remember.
No, we actually did it at the Patton Boy Scout Camp in Lakeland, Georgia, right north of Valdosta.
Okay.
Called Lakeland. It's out at the Patton Boy Scout Camp. We
I see.
held an event there a few times. Weird question, but it has merit.
Sure.
Jeff and I can attest to this. Anybody who's listening to this podcast who does living history or work at museums who collect militaria, web gear, tents, blankets, they all have their own unique smell. You can easily distinguish a original haversack from a reproduction just based on the smell. Mm-hmm. As you started shooting these jackets, did you notice that the leather and the silk liners, they all kind of had a similar historical smell? Can you sit in your room right now and recall that smell of those jackets?
I think the smell had pretty much gone from these jackets. I mean, they're some of them 80 years old now, so I think that aspect had gone, but definitely the texture, and you can tell. I mean, I remember that canvas smell from my dad, on his web belt and things like that. I remember that distinctly, so I know exactly what you're talking about, but no, I didn't smell that too much, but
Smells like freedom.
yeah, really, yeah. But one thing I did notice was that if the jackets weren't, so for instance, in the 475th Fighter Group, which is in Chino, which is way east LA, a dry environment, they had basically a big Quonset hut, and they have a airworthy P-38 was flown by one of their pilots, painted up like one of their pilots. And they store it in that hangar, so to speak. But they also just had some wooden cases around the perimeter with glass facades, but there was no climate control at all, from what I could tell. And when we took those jackets out of the case, and I put them on a light box, I made a 4 foot by 4 foot light box, essentially. It was a foot off the ground, and I would get up on a ladder and shoot down on the jackets. But these jackets, I mean, they were flaky. I mean,
Yeah.
they were literally crumbling, in my hands. So I tried not to handle them too much, but and that's the thing I try and get across to some of these museums is that they're going to turn to dust one day. So if you don't photograph them or preserve them in some visual manner like this, you're not going to have anything to fall back on, so to speak.
John, was there a moment where you kind of had to pinch yourself? Was there any of those kind of moments where you couldn't believe you were lucky enough to be there?
Yeah, a little bit, I mean, especially with Jimmy Stewart's jacket, I mean, he's such an iconic character and he's a personal hero, movie actor and, the real deal as far as a combat pilot and that sort of thing. And some of the other jackets too, I equate it to touching history. I really do, and I, and it's not like I got jollies out of handling the jackets or anything, but it's like one of the jackets that was sent to me from Oakland, California. The son, who's a fine art painter, he and his wife both had done a ton of research on his dad's personal history. And he found a picture of his dad standing on the ramp in England wearing this jacket that I photographed. And he's standing next to General Doolittle.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, this is
That's pretty cool.
That's history.
yeah.
That
So I'm
is
like,
correct.
how does this stuff happen to me?
That's pretty cool.
So yeah, there were definitely some moments like that,
I love that stuff.
yeah, and but I've heard my main specialty for the last, I don't know, 15 years or so has been aviation. So you hear these generally rich guys, who own these P-51s and these fighter planes and so on.
Tom Cruise.
They're basically just caretakers of history, really, and it's probably a nice big fat tax write-off, if I know anything, but I don't know that for a fact, but that's my guess. But they are preserving history, and that's one point that Jeff Schrader made. He said, not only are museums collecting these jackets, but there's a fair number of private collections. And these guys are caretakers of history. And I had never thought about it like that, and so
Yeah, for sure.
that was a very good point. But yeah, to answer your question, yeah, there's several jackets. I got to photograph Hub Zemke's jacket at the Air Force Museum, and I
Oh,
didn't
wow.
really know anything about him until I read up on him and like, this is cool.
Yeah.
And it's just a red liner on the inside. There's no artwork on the outside at all. But he was an ace, and in his unit, if you were an ace, you could get a red cloth liner put in, which he did. And it's just fantastic. It's this gorgeous red color. And
Yeah. When I saw that in the book, that was really something. I mean, I'm familiar with Zemke, but the red liner was, man, did that pop. It is a beautiful jacket.
yeah.
It doesn't need anything on the outside.
No, it didn't, and I, to be honest with you, I struggled early on with, because with digital, you can, these were all digital files. You can really pop the color if you want to increase the saturation, and early on, I didn't want to do it too much. I've always been a fan of punchy colors, but you can go overboard and make it Mickey Mouse colors real easy, and I didn't want to do that. So I kind of toned it down initially, but then I got to thinking about it a little more, and I'm like, I bet when these were new, these were fantastic. If you walked into a room full of these, it must have knocked your eye out,
I
And
was
of course,
just
we don't have any color pictures from that time, which is such a shame, but I'm like, I think we can give myself a little leeway to pop this color up a little.
before you said that, I was thinking in my head, you can't hold it against yourself because you're digitally compensating for history because paint fades over time, and so
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
probably restoring it to its closer
Yeah.
context.
Yeah.
This is probably
exactly.
an answer Jeff maybe knows, and I know you probably know, but I'm a novice when it comes to this particular realm.
That's okay.
Obviously, when it came to mass production of World War II uniforms, gear, what have you, it was done by different manufacturers. When it came from these jackets, how many different manufacturers were there loosely? Or more importantly, is there a particular manufacturer that when collectors are looking for, I want one of these jackets from this particular manufacturer versus this one over here?
Right. It's funny. I found a book written by a guy named Sweeting, who was a curator at the Smithsonian, and he had written a book about Air Corps uniforms and so on, and part of it was about the A2s and so on. So I relied on that pretty heavily. But he talks about There were, as I understand it, there were 18 different manufacturers, mostly in the Northeast, because that's where the bulk of the garment industry was. There were some in Pennsylvania, there were some around Chicago and that sort of thing, but most were New York, New Jersey, that sort of thing. And the way I understand the procurement system worked at the time is the government bought all the parts, the components for the jackets. They bought the leather, they acquired the zippers, the linings, the woolen cuffs and waistbands, the snaps, the whole 9 yards, so to speak. And then they gave it to the manufacturers along with the drawing. This, of course, was after the contract was awarded, and said, build us a jacket. And so from what I understand, they would assemble this jacket for about $8.25. And a fellow that I swapped emails with, I think, later on, said, now you got to remember that didn't include the physical cost of the items. So, he thinks it was probably $4 or $5 for the physical items. So for $13, $14, they built an A2 jacket.
Wow.
Yeah. And,
Man.
And my best guess, between what I found, there's a book written by a fellow in England, the Type A2 Flight Jacket Identification Manual, Eastman leather jackets. And this fellow Eastman actually did some DNA analysis on some of these jackets to find out if they were horsehide or cowhide. And but he has a wonderful chart in the back of the book that outlines the manufacturers, the contract numbers and all that sort of thing. And I took the time to add up the contract numbers and so on. And from another fellow in England, that I corresponded with, best I can tell, there were about 750,000 of these jackets produced. But
Wow.
there is no official number because they came into the inventory in 1931, if I remember correctly. And during the Depression years, the military budgets were pretty limited. And there were several years, where they bought 500 jackets. And there were several years there were no records kept. So if they bought jackets, we don't know how many they bought, and that sort of thing. And I tried to find that out. I even went so far as to trying to find out, several of the jackets have an AN stamp on there with a number, which was the inspector's, signature, so to speak. And I'd love to find a list of who the inspectors were, and maybe see if they have any ancestors who have, records that they might have kept, something like that. You could probably go pretty far down a rabbit hole if you really wanted to pursue it, but, and I even thought about trying to find some of the physical buildings where these jackets were manufactured, but I think most of those are gone now too. So from what I could tell, about 18 different manufacturers. And the one that comes to mind as far as, there were some variations on the theme. That was one thing that really surprised me early on. I always thought they were just brown jackets and the cuffs and waistband were, dark brown. Well, some of the jackets, the waistbands and the cuffs were almost bright red. And it was just the dye that the manufacturer used. So there were some variations. There were also some variations on the cut of the flaps for the the pockets, are the corners sharp or are they rounded a little bit? The same for the collars, is the collar a little longer? Stuff like that, And there are people out there online, there are several discussion forums where there are guys who pole vault over that stuff, and just can tell you how many threads per inch and is it the right color. I'm sorry, I'm not that guy. I don't want to be that guy, It's funny, a friend of mine several years ago, who's a photographer, he said, when this book comes out, you're going to become the jacket guy. And I'm like, I don't really want to be the jacket guy.
Got bad news for you.
I don't want people calling me at, 2:00 in the morning. Is this the right jacket? And I'm like, I don't know. I think I could, push come to shove, I could probably tell an authentic jacket from a later fake one. But I am not an expert on these jackets in any way, shape, or form. As far as the physical, makeup of them. But
so what you're saying is, don't anticipate a appearance of you on Pawn Stars when Rick calls you up for the expert opinion.
I mean, I could. Yeah, I can talk about it in general like we're doing here, but can I authenticate the XYZ jacket? Maybe, maybe not, But call Jeff Schrader. He can do a much better job than I can. But to go back to your question about, is there one favorite over another? One manufacturer's name that I keep hearing pretty often is Roughwear, and they were made in Pennsylvania, if I recall. And that's a pretty standard looking A2 jacket. I think most of the companies that make replicas, Eastman, Goodwear, the Real McCoys, etc., they all have a Roughwear style jacket, and a lot of people seem to like them, so hopefully that answers your question.
John, was there any moments where maybe something on the jacket kind of solved a riddle?
It's funny you say that. I found one or two jackets where I made a discovery that the museums didn't know. Actually, two jackets. So on the back of the A2 that I shot at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, they had one jacket. Apparently, a former volunteer had helped himself to the vast majority of their collection. But the one jacket they had, I'm told, was an authentic Flying Tigers jacket. Ooh. And it had a patch on the front. It's not in the book. It didn't make the cut, actually. But on the back, there was a rectangle. You could see the outline of a rectangle where a patch had been, And I'm not sure if you know what a blood chit is. That's something else.
Yes,
but it looked like a blood chit had been on the back of the jacket. And I pointed that out to the curator, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't know that." I'm like, "Come on, guys, look." Because part of it's, it's a slightly different color than the rest of the jacket and that sort of thing.
Yes, sir.
And they just never paid attention to it. And but as probably they had a big fire in the 70s and it burned a lot of their records and so on. So they don't really know who owned the jacket. There's no name tape or anything on it. And another jacket that I came across at the 390th, I discovered that it was not a 390th member. It had, so there was an aircraft called 5 Grand, which was the 5,000th Boeing B-17 off the line, and they had a big 5 Grand painted on the nose, and all of these signatures from all the workers, and phone numbers and addresses, and will you marry me, and all this kind of stuff. Apparently, it added several hundred pounds to the plane and slowed it down by 2 or 3 miles an hour. But anyway, so I'm looking at this jacket that I photographed at the 390th, and it had a real faint look like the 5 Grand logo on the breast of the jacket, So I'm looking at it, and I looked up the picture of the plane, and I'm like, boy, that looks like it, And I looked down below, and usually the name tape was up fairly high on the left breast, and it wasn't, I forget the exact dimensions, but it wasn't real big. It was like a 1/2 inch tall and 4 inches long, something like that. And but this name tape was right above the pocket, so it was kind of unnoticeable, And I looked down, and the guys had the name on it. So I looked up the guy's name, and sure enough, he was in the crew that transported the aircraft from the States to England. And then when it got to England, it was farmed out. It's like, okay, well, this airplane's going over here, and you guys are going over here. So they didn't get the plane anymore. But I guess they had to have the jackets painted up, And I called up the curator at the 390th, and I'm like, do you know this? And he's like, I don't know. It's like, go back to sleep. But,
that's pretty cool.
So I made a couple of, unintentional discoveries in that regard,
Yeah, that's awesome.
And it's fun, and I learned a few things, and hopefully, enlightened a few other folks, which is okay. So I hope he's not listening, but c'est la vie and deja vu and all that, so anyway,
is there
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is there a particular jacket that stands out in your mind as having the most intricate or maybe just the most awe-inspiring imagery on the back of it? One that just separates itself from the rest of them that you've had the experience of looking at?
Yeah, this one here in the background here was one of them. The 390th, if I had to pick out one collection in the country, the 390th had the most visually compelling collection by far. They just had some spectacular artwork on their jackets. And so and they're very proud of them, so at the museums that I shot at, the deal was, if you'll let me in the door, I'll photograph these jackets, and you will get high-res JPEGs of these files, for your records. And the 390th actually did some things with them that I hadn't contemplated. They created an Adopt a Jacket campaign. They wanted to fundraise for some new display cases. And so, adopt this jacket, give us a few bucks, etc. And it was successful. They raised enough money to get new cases.
Wow.
And they rotate the jackets through on a regular basis. That's something they routinely do. And so when they were pulling the jackets out of one of these cases, a moth flew out.
Oh.
Which horrified the curator, And they went back to the pictures that I had done, because they're so high resolution, and they compared my picture to the condition of the jacket. Unfortunately, the moth hadn't done any damage, but that was another use of the pictures that I hadn't contemplated.
That's pretty cool.
So I'm like, yeah, that's cool. So they do have value, in certain ways, and I'm hoping these museums, I gave the high-res files to the Air Force Museum, and the last time I checked, they still hadn't put them online. So I don't know what the deal is there, but the pictures of the jackets they do have online are god awful. I mean, it looked like it was shot with an iPhone 5 through the glass, and reflections and tungsten light. And, other than that, they're okay. But
it's like that old famous gif of the teapot someone was selling on eBay. You could see the reflection of them in the teapot.
Yeah, and I'm like, guys, this is the best I can do here, but I think it's pretty much state of the art. You're welcome to use it, and they have it. So, you can lead a horse to water and all that. But
that's a kind of a theme in those kind of places. It's
I
very
was just
odd.
going to say that there's one consistent thing about museums is nothing happens fast.
Yeah, I have discovered that. Yeah, and and I mean
annoying.
The National Museum of the U.S. of the 8th Air Force down in Pooler, they just started carrying the book this spring. And I tried to start the project there early on and was turned down, rebuffed rather rudely by their curator, and I wrote him a letter and basically told him. Well, I'm not going to tell you what I told him, but it was pretty cool, shall we say. And, and I've got a marketing guru that I hired to help promote the book, and she's basically got them convinced now that they need to hire me to come and shoot their jackets, which would be, sweet retribution. Because I'm told, they have upwards of 160 jackets themselves.
That'd be a whole nother book.
I know one of the guys that I photographed in the book, his actual jacket is in the museum, Punchy Powell. In the portrait that I did of him, he's wearing a replica, but, I have seen his jacket in the display case there. And, and they're just undergoing, I think, a $12 million expansion and so on. And I'm friends now with several people on their board, and I just photographed their chairman of the trustees and so on this spring. And, maybe one of these days they'll get around to, figuring out that they can do something with these jackets besides store them in the case in the back room,
Yeah.
But they're not doing any good, where they are now. And, so, that's the other thing I discovered too. I had several museums turn me down, basically for manpower reasons. They said they didn't have enough personnel to devote to, pulling the jackets out and having me come and spending a day or whatever. And I'm like, okay, all you can do is say fine. But, the 8th Air Force thing really ticked me off because of the way it was done. Had they said no in a nice way, it would have been fine, but it wasn't nice. And that really ticked me off. Anyway.
You made reference to the 1970s record fire, which we've discussed on the show quite often because my grandfather's records were in there. Another, sad for multiple reasons, but pertaining to this subject matter, we were talking earlier about clearly the men who painted these jackets are artists, and they came from the artist background, and then you follow that up by saying in your experience that you thought the 390th bomb group had some of the better jackets. Mm-hmm. How awesome would that be if that record fire never happened, that we could actually go back and learn some of the names and history of these guys who painted these jackets? But,
right.
Those names are just lost to history.
Yeah, there were two or three where the artist signed the jacket, so we know there's two of them that I know of in the book who we know who the artist was. One of them was Harry Hall, Holl, and he became I think he was already famous before the war. Even he was a potter actually after the war on Long Island, and very famous in that regard. But he was a jacket painter, and another guy was Gorimko, who had been a sign painter before the war, and he painted the 100th Bomb Group jacket. I'll think of it here in a minute, but um, for one of the guys in the book, and it's pretty famous artwork now, actually. Um, but it yeah. So most of it is lost to history, to answer your question as to who painted the jackets. And the other thing I found out too was that in Italy, I think the Italians came over to our side in '43 when they wised up, and so there apparently were some R&R bases in Corsica, and guys would go there and have custom patches made, 15th Air Force, but they were in size leather. They cut these leather pieces and layered them, and colored them, and they were really intricate. And so to make a few bucks, they would do this custom artwork. And one of the jackets in particular that I photographed has a Black Panther on it in a square patch, and it is just spectacular.
Mm.
And so and some of the other jackets, I'm sure, were painted off post, so to speak, off the base by local artists, even in Italy, and I think even in India, because either guys didn't have the interest or didn't have the time to paint them, so they would hire a local artist to paint, because people were looking for ways to make money any way they could. And so, it was not a uniform thing, so to speak. It wasn't always a crewman, a fellow crewman who painted, although that did happen sometimes, a fellow crewman who would paint the jackets, or a local artist in the unit, that sort of thing.
Well, you've certainly piqued my interest on the 390th because I visited the Pima Museum several times. I was there about 2 years ago, and boy, they have really, since the first time I was there in probably the early 90s, that place has really grown. That is a beautiful museum, the Pima County Air Museum.
Yeah.
And they've got a pretty famous A2 that I remember hanging up in there. It has nothing to do with it being original, but it's who wore it. And if I remember correctly, they have Catherine Weiler's A2 hanging in there with the Memphis Belle painted on the back. Of course, Catherine is the daughter of William Wyler, who did the original documentary, and then Catherine was the producer for the Memphis Belle movie in 1990. So that was an interesting jacket to see in there. That's not, of course, not necessarily some historical value, but more from a Hollywood icon, I guess, value. But back to your book, you've got a lot of surprises in there, John. I mean, just flipping through there, when you see a book that size, it's like 400 and some odd pages, 12 inches by 12 inches. It's an enormous coffee table book. And again, it is beautiful. It is art. It's very artistic. It's very well done. But some of the surprises were, for me, the beautiful full color artwork of some of the aircraft. Folks may not exactly know what a P-38 looks like or a B-17. And you mentioned Punchy Powell a minute ago. And, when we got off the phone, that little nugget of, oh, you need to look on the inside of the dust cover. And I'll say no more because I want people to buy the book and see what's inside the dust cover.
Thanks. Yeah.
But then, something I didn't really think about was the A2's, what it has done for fashion and the impact it's had. I mean,
Yeah.
we get the picture of Steve McQueen, right? Of course, I was going to see that in there. Then it veers into the Marlon Brando, and then we've got Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, and then all of a sudden you see Salt and Pepper, from the 90s. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, these leather jackets. And I will say there was one that I thought I was going to see that I didn't, and that's the Fonz. I expected to see a little Fonzie in there.
Right. Yeah. No, I so the images in that section, I licensed those myself. So, from two stock agencies. So there may have been budgetary constraints there. I can't remember but, the book was self-published and self-financed, so I'm still telling my wife that I'm going to pay her back, and that sort of thing. So, and we're working on it. We're going to the American Library Association conference at the end of the month in San Diego, where hopefully I'm going to. I am scheduled to give a presentation, and I'm hoping we'll be able to sell it to a bunch of libraries and universities and so on across the country.
Oh, yeah.
And if you guys want to get your own copy of Bomber Boys World War II Flight Jacket Art, please head over to WorldWar2BomberBoys.com. That's WWII, just like our website, WWIIBomberBoys.com. Books can be found there. Before we let you go, we have a segment called What You're Reading. And we're going to start with you, John. What you reading, fella?
Could I say one more thing up to that?
Absolutely, please.
There is a downloadable PDF on the website with all the jackets in the book. It's a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, and it'll give you the manufacturer, the date, how many were in the contract, if we know who the guy was that owned it, all that sort of thing, his unit and so on. So that's free to download on the website,
And as always, as you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, head over to WTSPWWII.com, and on the homepage there will be a photo going along with this episode. Click on that. It'll take you to our website where we'll have links to the website where you can purchase the book, John's social media links, and all that good stuff as well. But yeah, what you're reading, John?
It's funny. I put it down for a while, but I started reading again last night, Luck of the Draw by Frank Murphy, who was a B-17 crewman. He grew up here in Atlanta, and his daughter now works for CBS or NBC, one of the biggies up in New York. She was with CNN here in town, I think. But anyway, she was here recently promoting the book. They just republished it. And so I was reading it, and it's really quite interesting. And I've just read the prologue and started into the first chapter, but it's quite interesting. And he's actually his character has a cameo at the end, either episode 8 or 9 in Masters of the Air, where he's depicted in the POW camp. Because he was
wow.
Yeah, he was shot down and survived the war and that sort of thing. But so that's what I'm reading right now. And I just read stuff all the time. Somebody reminded me, or I saw something online, I can't remember yesterday or today, about the Berlin airlift, and the Berlin candy bomber.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to photograph Gail Halverson, who was the original candy bomber, when he was in town here in 2011, I think. And really a super nice man. But so I put up a little blurb about that today on Facebook and so on. I've always been interested in World War II history. We lived in Okinawa for 4 years when I was a kid.
Wow.
From when I was 8 until I was 12. And so, we lived off the post too for a time. And essentially there was a 1-lane road leading up the side of the hill where we lived. And I remember some EOD guys walking up the hill one day. There were some kids in some houses further up the hill, and they came walking back down the hill a little while later, and they were carrying machine gun belts, and I think they had some grenades and some rifles and helmets and all kinds of stuff that they had found in a hole.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think they're still finding stuff on the island, bombs and foundations and so on down in Naha where the capital was and so on. But
wow.
So just we lived in Richmond after my dad retired for a time, and Richmond, Petersburg, battlefield, Civil War, and and I graduated college in Chattanooga, and the Chickamauga battlefield is right down the street there.
Lookout Mountain.
Yeah, exactly. So it just kind of happens that I've been around these areas. When I was stationed in Germany, I wish I had gone to Normandy. I didn't, but we trained at Grafenwehr all the time, and that's where Rommel trained the Africa Corps.
Wow.
So,
That's wild.
You got to experience a lot of history.
When you walk the ground, you sort of get a sense of the place, so to speak. I remember I did get a chance to go to the Dachau concentration camp, which is literally. There's a sign right there, the Munich city limits, and then, there's the concentration camp. So there was no doubt in my mind the locals knew what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
But when I walked in through that gate, it was a cold, damp, overcast November day, and I got the heebie-jeebies just walking in the door. And I never get the heebie-jeebies, but I did that day.
Yeah, it's and I'm not making this comparison to be rude, but when it comes to the smell that those horrible places had to put off, for townspeople to say they had no idea. You go to Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, you talk to somebody who lives 5-8 miles downwind from a pig farm, they can tell you there's a pig farm down there. Because, that odor does travel. So to say that you had no idea of the mounds and mounds of human remains rotting, and you had it's just unbelievable, because the smell would waft down there. There's no way they had no idea. There's no way.
They knew. Yeah.
Before the show, you and Jeff were talking about something that the two of you were discussing off air, and I thought it'd be great for this segment because Dennis is, he's done research for books and he's written a book himself. But you're talking about why books essentially have the shape in which they have and the history of that. And I said, save it for the air. I want to hear it, and I know Dennis wants to hear it too. So give us a brief, how and why do books have the current shape and fit that they have?
Do you want to talk about it, Jeff, or you want me to?
I guess I could start it.
Well, I mean, I can talk about it if you want me to.
Well, yeah, no, go ahead then. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was an Instagram post that I came across, I think this morning. I can't remember, yesterday or today, but a fellow was talking about how papyrus was originally the first paper, so to speak, and it was interleaved, and so it came out in a square shape because that was, how it worked out, So the early books were square, and then when paper became dominant, they would fold. So the paper was shaped in an animal shape, rectangular. And I'm probably leaving out something, Jeff.
Yeah. So after papyrus, they went to the parchment, which was made of animal skin.
Yes. Yeah.
And when they were tanning it and everything, it was typically more rectangular. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what they would do is they would, take this rectangle and they would fold it into fours and then cut it. So it made 4 sheets, but the sheets were still rectangular, and there was a name for the section of 4, which I forget now. But so that's why books, and because they had already been doing the parchment that way, the guys who literally were hand scribing, the copies, they just continued with that format because they were used to it.
That's awesome.
So that's why most books are rectangular.
And it makes sense too, because after they started to industrializing it and printing it up, you're not going to remachine your plant because somebody wants to shape the book a little different way.
Yeah, it's funny. This book was an expensive book to print, and
yeah, for sure.
And when I walked into the factory, there's a little video I think on the website, where I went to the factory a couple of times to do press checks and so on, and to do the proofs early on. And you walk out on the floor and you literally see pallets full of paper, and I'm like, and it had Slemp on it, and I'm like, oh. This is what I'm buying, and, and they were just reams awesome. And reams and reams of paper, and
yeah, that's a cool thing.
Yeah, so we had 5,000 books printed, I could have stopped at 2,500, but it wasn't that much more to go to 5,000, and I don't know, maybe I'm nuts, who knows, but I'm hoping that as it gets out into the world. We've sent 3 to Australia, and I just sent 1 to South Africa, and I got a note from the guy the other day, who just loves it. We've only gotten 5-star reviews on the website.
That's awesome.
We sent it off to a company called Blue Ink Reviews this spring that does independent book reviews, and it got a starred review, which apparently only 5% of the books there get. And so the Fashion Book of the Year, it's won silver in 2 international graphic design competitions, so, if it's the only book I ever do, I think I'll be pretty happy with, with the mark I left in that regard.
Absolutely.
When we were shopping it around early on, and I only got lukewarm response, to be honest with you. And this was long before Masters of the Air. I didn't even know that was ongoing, It's just a total coincidence that this came out at the same time, essentially. But, it occurred to me that even if somebody had said, yes, it's going to go into a queue, it's going to be a year before they get to it, and then there's going to be their considerations, and recommendations on how many pages and the layout and what pictures to put in there and all that. And I'm like, heck with it. I know what I want in the book. And I didn't want to compromise, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, I contacted Darren Guillory, who's the graphic designer. He and I had worked together on an advertising job in 2014. Fabulous designer. And I told him what I was doing, and he got excited. He said, "I want to do this, and I'll do it for free."
Nice.
And I said, "No." I said, "No, you won't do it for free." And there's two reasons. One, you're a pro, you need to get paid. And two, I want it done in this lifetime. No weekend and holidays and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
Free and fast don't go together.
Yeah, so that's what we did. And
Hey, John.
yes,
There was my dad and I did a book series together about his time in Iraq and then Afghanistan with War Dogs, and we self-published out of Akron, Ohio, and we took the trip. We drove up there, and I gotta say, and I'm really curious to see if you had the same feeling, but to see the pages go down those machines, just and we had the guy that run the company owned it. We inspired him, and he actually set up cameras and filmed the cover going just hundreds, just pop, 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 pop. And Dad and I'm even getting goosebumps right now because the multiple hours sitting there typing and editing and formulating in our minds, and then to see it on the presses. I mean, magical.
Yeah. It's a 398 page book. If you count the index and all that stuff, and it literally consumed my 2022. I spent about the first 3 or 4 months getting the text all together, and then I sent it to Darren, and he probably spent 3 months laying it out, nonstop, full time, right? And I didn't really make a lot of changes. He's a fabulous designer, and I liked his instincts on it. And I'm like, this looks great to me, let's go with it. And when we got to that stage, I turned it over to a copy editor, and she's a professional proofreader, And by the time we got through that, she made over 1,500 changes to the text, mostly punctuation that I had long forgotten since high school and things like that.
Sure.
Not too many, grammatical changes, fortunately. I said to Jill, I thought I was a pretty good writer. She said, "You are." And I'm like, "Well, you could have fooled me." but she said, "Well, if you don't want to do the changes, don't put my name on it. But, this is my recommendation." I'm like, no, we'll do it. I just had a little hard time at first wrapping my head around it.
Yeah, that's tough.
We took the time, we got it done, and then I sent it to the press, and they did proofs, and I went down in October, and we spent 7 hours straight going through all 398 pages, just looking at color and making, there were a few typos. We fixed that, and then I sent it to the professional indexer, and she did that in 2 weeks, fortunately, and then it went to press, and by the time it went through the press, the rest of October and November, and then the cover being put on it and all that, it was literally the week before Christmas before I got it. But
well, I would say the proof is in the pudding, and to see Jeff's reaction, because Jeff is a pretty laid back combat veteran, and to see how excited he was about that book. I mean, you definitely struck a chord there, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. And before I forget, Don, you mentioned the illustrations. So at one point I got to thinking there's probably a lot of people these days that don't know what a B-17 looks like, or a P-38 or whatever. And I had seen the picture of Punchy Powell's airplane, in a small format somewhere, and I contacted the artist. His name is John Mollison, and he's in Dakota, I think it's North Dakota, and I asked him if I could use it in the book, and he said no. And I'm like, okay, well, I got to respect that. And he said, "I'll tell you why." He said, "I did that 20 years ago, and I can do it better now. Let me do," and I had sent him some pictures, told him what I was doing. He said,
Wow.
"Let me do a new one for you."
Wow.
That's cool.
That's cool.
That's the one that's in the book. And we got to talking, and I said, "Well, can I license these other ones from you?" And he said, "No, you can use them for free."
That's awesome.
I was shocked. So there's 7 or 8. There's a Stearman, B-17, P-38, P-51. I'm probably forgetting some, I'm sure, several different aircrafts that are in the book depicted. And, and I think it, added greatly to the whole. It really did. And that was the other thing too. I was really fortunate to have some wonderful collaborators on the book. John and Jeff Schrader and Laura and and Darren, the work he did, and Jill with the proofreading and the index, and all of it just kind of came together, kind of magically in a way, to be honest with you. And I think everybody involved was pretty proud of it, to be honest with you.
We know you mentioned one jacket earlier, and then I'll get to Dennis and Jeff and what they're reading. You mentioned one jacket that didn't meet the cut. Roughly how many jackets didn't meet the cut that didn't make the book? Was there just the one or a few?
So I shot 162 jackets across the country, some from public collections, not all museums. We did 12 museums and then, I don't know, 30 or 40 privately owned jackets. So there's 104 jackets in the book. I have the list right here in front of me. And so only 3 from the Smithsonian made the cut. 10 from the Air Force Museum, 26 from the 390th, 3 from the Kalamazoo Air Zoo in Michigan, 5 from the 475th, 17 from March Field. That was the other big museum, pretty good museum in Riverside. 3 from the Indiana Military Museum, which is a little tiny museum in Vincennes, Indiana. They had 2 jackets that were associated with the atomic bomb mission.
Wow.
Oh, man.
One of them is the tail gunner on the Enola Gay.
Whoa.
And I'm like, how does this stuff happen to me? I'm like, talk about a jacket to get, and then 37 individually owned jackets. So 104 are in the book.
What was the criteria? Was it just maybe the quality of the jacket, not enough background on the owner? Was it?
Yes and yes. And part of it was just
condition,
visual attraction. Is it attractive visually?
Sure.
And Darren did a lot of the choosing, and then we massaged that at one point. But by and large, I was pretty happy with what he chose, to be honest with you.
Wow, that's amazing.
Hey, Dennis, fella, what's going on? How you been?
Doing good.
What you reading?
I am reading a book called Golden Bones. And this is a gentleman I met while I was dressed as a German soldier for my very first time a couple months ago with Jeff. And I was walking the perimeter because that's what you do as a German. And this guy pulled over in his car and he came out and he was like, "Can I get my photograph with you?" And I was like, "Sure." And he was just so impressed. He just never thought he'd see a crowd walking the perimeter in our old Brooks Field. And so we walk over there, and then he starts talking to me, and turns out he was the U.S. ambassador to the UN for both President Bushes.
Wow.
And this book, Golden Bones, is about his escape from Cambodia.
Wow.
And Khmer Rouge, and being in a labor camp, and all the death and destruction and the near close calls, and his that's what when it comes down to it, America is probably one of the very few places where you can go from that to you're the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and I just freaking love that about this country. But the book is absolutely phenomenal. It's called Golden Bones, and just such a great read.
Hey, Jeff, when you're not perusing that beautiful, colorful book of bomber jackets that you have behind you, what you been reading?
Well, it's funny. This is the first time I've read about this campaign in its entirety. It's always a chapter or two or a footnote in other books I read, but this is the first book I've read strictly about the Doolittle Raid, and it is called The Doolittle Raid, America's Daring First Strike Against Japan by Carol V. Glines. Basic synopsis was it was the biggest gamble of World War II, but Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle's legendary bombing raid on Japan gave America the morale boost it needed in the wake of Pearl Harbor. This is the full story told by the Doolittle Raiders official historian. And it definitely shows when you read this, because you can tell the author, or he'll tell you in the pages that these were from personal interviews, not just from the raiders themselves, but from several of the Chinese that ended up helping them, and some of the missionaries that were over there in China as well. So it's really neat. Like I said, this is the first time I've read about the Doolittle Raid in detail, so I'm really, really enjoying it. And, of course, after meeting Dick Cole several times, man, I wish I would have read this. So I have so many more questions, and, of course, now I'll never get to ask them. But I'm very fortunate to have some really neat conversations with him through the years. But now on a deeper level, That's how it always is. Now I wish I had one more day with him.
For sure.
Yeah,
John, did you get any Doolittle jackets?
I did. Dick Cole's small portrait is in the book, but yes, I got the Navigator on the number 9 crew at the airport.
How cool is that?
Yeah, that was one of the ones. They gave me a list. I could get 25 or 30 jackets, and I definitely cherry picked. And that was one of the jackets I absolutely wanted.
That is so cool.
I got a Tuskegee Airman jacket there too.
Oh, awesome.
They're very rare. The Tuskegee Airman jackets are very rare, and there's a Wasp jacket in the book, the Women Air Force Service Pilots.
Nice.
They were extremely rare too.
That's awesome.
So, there's, I tried to cover the basis in that regard. I have photographed 8 different Tuskegee Airmen, and there's a group shot of 6 of them in the book, and then General McGee is also in the book. There's a couple of pages devoted to the Wasp, even though they weren't, combat people, so to speak. But, I thought it would be interesting to put them in there. Again, I'm trying to make it a book that I'd like to read.
Well done, John. I'm very, this sounds crazy, but I'm really proud of you because that's going to last generations, and it's preserved now. So thank you for all that hard work.
Hey, John, before we wrap it up, where can people find you? We discussed your website, but I know you're on Instagram and Facebook. Where can people track you down if they want to learn more information about you, your book, and what you got going on now?
Well, my regular photo website is just johnslemp.com, and that's SLEMP, Sierra Lima Echo Mike Papa. And then the WWII bomberboys.com is the book website. And from there, we have a YouTube channel too now. I never thought I'd have a YouTube channel, but we have several interviews on there with me, but also some of the veterans, and they're pretty illuminating too.
Nice.
So those are the two main, to be honest with you, I'm not a huge social media guy for lots of reasons. I guess I'm too old to get excited about it.
Yeah, but it's almost required nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah,
I
for sure.
participate in that regard. But, I could spend 24 hours a day doing social media, if I let it take my life over. But, I've got other things to do.
Yes, sir.
We want to thank each and every one of you for your continued support over the last 5.5 some odd years. And as always, please head over to WTSPWWII.com to download all of our podcasts, see our photos, and all of that good stuff. Head over to our merch page, buy yourself a shirt kind of like the one I'm wearing now with the K rations on it. And I know Jeff has one underneath his jacket over there. He's got the Red Ball logo. And speaking of YouTube channels, head over to youtube.com, look for D410 Media. I just posted part 2 of my interview with the 105-year-old World War II vet, John Skeen, so that is up there. The full version of that, much like the full version of the other podcast and some of the content Jeff has coming up, will be available to our Patreon subscribers. So head over to patreon.com, look for D410 Media, or click on the Patreon link on our website. But for myself, Jeff Copsetta, Dennis Blogger, and John Slemp, thank you guys so much, and we will talk to you all next week.
This has been a Digital 410 production.